Thank you, Rosie. I said no spoilers, okay? I have got for you tonight a rather unlikely love story. And it involves a refugee from Eastern Europe and a man in his mid-60s with an incurable degenerative brain disease. That's me, by the way. And if that sounds a bit of a downer, don't worry. It's going to be, we're hoping for a happy ending to this talk. I hope we'll get there. And it's also a talk about social media, which has turned so toxic in my time covering it as a technology correspondent. I've been immersed in it for most of the last 20 years. But this is a story where social media plays a wonderful role. So this picture was taken at about 2:45 a.m. on December the 17th, 2022. Sophie has just arrived at her house on a transport from Romania. It's taken her 3 days, and she is absolutely terrified. You can see from her ears, they're folded in, they're her great feature, but she is suffering from what a behaviorist who we work with told us was neophobia, fear of the new. Being on a transport for 3 days across Europe, that was new to her. She did not like it. Being in a house, that was new for her. That was terrifying. Meeting people, that was also horrific. But we were optimistic because we'd had a rescue dog before. Things would be fine. We took her in, and she immediately spent some time trying to find the smallest space imaginable, and eventually settled on behind our sofa in the living room. And there she was to spend many months. But I asked myself, how did it come to this? Because I didn't have a background with dogs. I was never meant to fall in love with a dog. This is me, aged 5, at Ruskin Park House, a posh council estate, but a council estate nevertheless, on the borders of Camberwell and Dulwich. The residents thought of themselves as more Dulwich than Camberwell, but it was really Camberwell. Where I lived with my mother, who brought me up on her own. She had been, and still was, working in the BBC television drama department. Very exciting time. She was in her mid-40s, and she had an affair with a man who turned out to be 16 years her junior. And it ended badly, and she ended up bringing me up on her own. And actually, when she died in 1996, I found a huge store of letters covering most of her life, an extraordinary collection, out of which I created another book called Ruskin Park. Quick plug there. But the key thing about this council estate was there was a big rule: no pets. And my mum was quite pleased about that because she thought dogs in particular were nasty, smelly, and dangerous things. And I agreed with her because I did agree with my mother about most things. And so I was not interested in dogs. But there was one person in my life, or theoretically in my life, who thought differently about dogs. My father. The trouble was, I didn't meet him till I was 23 when I wrote to him. My dad went on, after my parents split up, to become a very distinguished TV drama director. And somehow, in every production he ever did, he managed to smuggle in a dog, from Shakespeare to Play for Today. And this, last year, BBC 4 repeated one of his great series, Fortunes of War, done in the 1980s. It was where Kenneth Branagh met Emma Thompson for the first time. That worked out well for a while until it didn't. And I was watching this idly. My dad, it was some years after my dad had died, and I came across this scene and froze the frame. It's a scene set on a Bucharest rooftop during the early years of World War II, where a dissident is hiding from the sort of stormtroopers, the Nazi stormtroopers, and he has with him a dog as a companion. And suddenly I thought, my God, that dog, filmed in the late 1980s, looks rather like Sophie. I did get to know my dad and met his boxers. He was obsessed with boxer dogs, and I still was not that impressed because they were very rambunctious. My wife would always change into her worst jeans when we went over because we were going to get licked to death. But somehow we ended up getting a dog. I didn't know quite how it happened. My wife said it was for one of our kids who was having some discipline problems, and we'd get a dog for them at Christmas. But somehow I came home in November from a foreign trip, and we had a dog, and I was, what's this about? And I was suspicious at first, but I grew to love this dog with the unlikely name of Cabbage, and she was good for my health. Because I was, middle-aged, running to Flab, and we started running together. She needed three walks a day, of which 3 a week turned into runs. I competed in half marathons. She was a good thing. Gradually, though, we both began to slow down, and in 2019, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and she became even more important to me because the one great thing you can do to try and stop this progressive disease, I love that word, progressive, progressing, is to take regular exercise. The drugs don't really do anything but mask the symptoms. So a daily walk with her was absolutely vital. But sadly, after an incident in which she was stolen and became a social media sensation, Cabbage grew sick, and we had to have her put to sleep. And we were very cut up, and it was nearly a year before we welcomed Sophie into our home. And as you can see, Sophie had a difficult time. She found that spot, and she only shifted from that spot after a while to go out in the garden, which was a relief because that meant she was house-trained. But for 6 months, probably, she spent 90% of her time behind the sofa, not walking with me. Her job was supposed to be to walk with me. It was a great disappointment. And it was also a great worry. I lay awake at night worrying about what I would find when I came downstairs, and too often found nothing. But there was one great support, which was that very quickly, Sophie became a social media sensation. I started this hashtag, Sophie from Romania, and this is just 10 days after she arrived. And she did make surprising progress at first, which then later disappointed. She came out one evening and took bits of sausage from my hand, and I posted a video. And you can see just how excited people became. There were 2.5 million views, 32,000 likes, endless reposts, and there was this wave of love swamping us almost, and it was incredibly cheering. There was a DJ, Nick Grimshaw, who said around Christmas, "I can't believe everyone isn't following the story of Sophie from Romania. I'm obsessed with it." And this, in this rather difficult time, buoyed us up. It also brought us via Twitter direct message, a wonderful man called Si, who lived in northern Scotland, who became our behavioural advisor, and also my kind of therapist in a way, because this dog caused me great anxiety. But things got worse. By the summer, she was still not coming out from behind the sofa. She was still not sleeping in the bed we'd bought her at Christmas. And Si decided action was needed. We needed to take her to the vet and get her put on antidepressants. Now, taking her to the vet was a terrifying event because she'd never been out of the house. But we got there and we got her prescribed fluoxetine. I got home, I Googled it. It's Prozac. And I was embarrassed. My first sensation was embarrassment. It felt very overheard in Waitrose. Oh, our lurcher Jasper's been seeing a therapist for 3 weeks now, and he's made so much progress. I could not believe we were doing this with a dog. Now, we were told it could take up to 6 weeks for the drugs to take any effect. And we waited and we waited and we waited and nothing happened. And then on the 7th day of the 6th week, literally, my wife Diane was standing at the front door, about to take rubbish out, and turned round. And the dog had never been beyond the living room door into the hall, as if there was a magic force field. And suddenly the dog was there, looking at her as if to say, "What's all this then? Is there an outside world?" And from then on, things began to get better. And there's things getting better. She's sleeping in the bed and she's mucking around with the shoe cabinet, with the shoe rack, and becoming playful and beginning to engage with me in a way that she hadn't until then. She'd engaged with Diane a bit, but not with me. About this time, I began to think about this stuff about dogs being man's best friend and wondering if it was all sentimental nonsense, and doing a bit of research and finding out, actually, there is some science behind it. There's this thing called oxytocin, a hormone which basically is a happiness hormone. And research has found that when a dog and a human interact in a friendly fashion, oxytocin levels in both rise. I'm afraid, cat lovers, it doesn't work with cats. It's just dogs. So there is some science behind it. So we were making great progress, and we were optimistic. The autumn came. We knew we had a lot more work to get her out for a walk, but it was going to work. We were getting a harness on her, and things were proceeding at the right pace. But then I had a fall. Mid-October, broke my elbow, bashed myself around a bit, had a terrible experience with the NHS. And the dog sensed this somehow, that the house was sunk in gloom. My Parkinson's, which had been on a fairly steady state, went down a whole level, progressed. And the dog seemed to know it, and we stopped making progress. And we got to the anniversary of her arrival. And we tried to be positive because lots of people out there on social media, where we painted quite an upbeat picture, told us we'd done so well. But what we hadn't done was what I began to think of as the big W, the walk. We still hadn't got her out for a walk. Christmas came and went. Our behaviourist Si was so determined to help us, he came down for weeks on end to rehearse getting her into the harness. He left us at the end of January. We had the harness on. I'd learnt to do up the catches very, very carefully while she looked at me very suspiciously. But we were almost there. But we couldn't quite push it to the limit. And then one day in late February, Diane said to me, and she's always been more decisive than me, but also more patient than me. I was growing increasingly impatient, but didn't know what to do about it. She said, "Tomorrow we're going to take the dog to the park and we're going to go for a walk." The next morning, a frosty February morning, we picked up the dog, put her in the car. She was terrified because the only time she'd been put in the car before was to go to the vet. She trembled all the way to the park. And I thought, this is not going to work. We got out of the car, and at first she seemed to be frozen in position, much as she had been the first morning when I had tried to take her out for a walk. Paws planted. And then she took a step, and then another step. And then I thought, we're walking. This is amazing. This is wonderful. And we had a great session. We went back home. For once, we took a little time. We waited until the next morning to actually tell social media what had happened. And there was this huge wave of love coming towards us. And it felt marvelous. So we'd achieved a lot. Sophie's journey continues. It's still completely uneven. But she's no longer Sophie from Romania. She's now Sophie from London. Thank you.